Okay, well, I am going to be brief because I'm in between ourselves and a really delicious lunch sponsored by Baker Botts. So I am just going to talk very briefly about the study overview. The reason I'm going to be brief is because this afternoon we will hear from the individual author of papers in the study, and tomorrow morning, same thing. So I am just going to try to put the presentations we're going to hear over the afternoon and into tomorrow in the context, in a general context. The first thing I want to say, there's a lot of research in the study. Some of it is political science and other kinds of disciplines that were used to inform the computer simulations. But basically, the overall study is based on a computer-assisted scenario analysis of the energy market. What makes this study different than some of the other studies that have been done that are really excellent studies is that it's a computer-assisted simulation of the energy market. So there's a lot of good engineering systems analysis that's gone into looking at this question, but it's not the same thing as having an intertemporal model that solves for every possible combination of energy market trade-offs between one fuel and another. So that is what we've done. In the great spirit of shell scenarios, our projections are not a forecast, right? So when I tell you X could happen under this scenario or that scenario, we have some prices we'll tell you tomorrow about where we think the price of natural gas could wind up. But it's not really, the study is not really intended to give you a forecast of what we think the world will be in 2025 or 2050. Really, our design here is to highlight the differences in effectiveness of various proposed policies. We have this wider range of policies that have been proposed and discussed in our media and on Capitol Hill. They're all talked about in an indifferentiated way, as if every single one of these policies would both reduce U.S. oil dependency on the Middle East or oil imports in general, and they would also completely lower our carbon emissions. And it's like they're all interchangeable. We could do them all. We could do some of them. We could do one of them. We could do any of them, and they would all have the same result. And the purpose of this study is to show that that is actually not true. There are a lot of trade-offs between one policy and another. You have to decide what your target is. If your target is to lower oil use in the United States, some policies are very effective at that. They don't lower emissions at all, right? We have other policies that would truly lower emissions, perhaps at a higher cost to consumers, but they weren't going to do anything to lower oil imports in the United States. So what we've tried to do in this study is really highlight the debate so that people understand what they're talking about. And I mentioned, I know some people in the audience from that company are here. Chevron Technology Ventures helped us look at U.S. biofuels policy. We published earlier this year a 170-page report together with our engineering department, and the results of how much that policy is costing the United States and how much gasoline is being substituted was shocking. I mean, just frighteningly shocking for how many billions of dollars we are spending to replace 2% of U.S. gasoline supply. So the idea of this study is to really think critically. You know, any politician can stand up and say, here's a way to help farmers, and it's going to lower our gasoline use. You hear it. It sounds smart. You vote for the guy. We put in the policy, and 10 years later, we have the same gasoline use as we had before. So our purpose with this study, to look at energy markets and to look at these different policies, is to really allow the public to make a cost-benefit analysis about what policy gets what results in terms of these different goals that we have, right? It's a simulation, it's models. We're not saying we have the exact price, we're not saying we have the exact volume, right? And we are not making a policy recommendation that X is the correct policy. What we are explaining is what the trade-offs are. And I think if you take the time to read the executive summary, what you're going to see is that the trade-offs are tremendously large. Ken Metlock and I sat down in trying to select some highlights for the executive summary to give bullets out to those of you in the media here. And we were trying to see if there was something we could say was the optimum one that both lowered oil imports and lowered emissions the maximum amount. And I have to tell you, looking at all the policies that have been proposed on Capitol Hill, it was impossible to say, here is one that really achieves both. It's very, very difficult, and at a cost that the rest of us would be willing to live with in a non-growing economy. So I encourage you to really look at the different scenarios and help the public think about what their actual goals are, what are our goals in this country, and what the trade-offs are, so that when we formulate policy, we can do it on what I call a higher level, with more information and a better thought through to where we're going to be 20 years after we pass whatever bill is going to pass. We looked at these policies from different perspectives. I mean, there's a lot of data in these charts. They can show you many more things than the things we chose to highlight in the executive summary, so I encourage you, if you're a reader, to actually sit down and read the actual longer papers. But we looked at the following things. We looked at how the international flow of oil and gas would change under different policies, what that meant for geopolitics. In other words, who's the big winner? Is Iran the big winner? Are we the big winner? Does Chavez win in Venezuela? We looked at who geopolitically wins from different policies. We also looked at, since everybody's so busy talking about U.S. energy independence, we looked at how close does this take us or not take us towards U.S. energy, well, self-sufficiency. There's probably no scenario we looked at that takes us there. But the thing that I, again, want to encourage you to do in my slides, don't 100%, grasp every single year. If I have to have one criticism of this administration, it is this. If you read the paper that's on the history of U.S. OPEC relations, what you will see is that Richard Nixon vowed that the United States would be energy independent by 1980. So for our leader to stand up and say, 50 years from now, this policy will produce X, I want to know between now and that 50 years, what's going to happen 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and 30 years from now. Because we also need to have a policy that takes into account what is the result of a policy 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And I hear nothing in our political debate that talks about the 5-year framework or the 10-year framework. And the 5-year, as a person who, my particular specialty is geopolitics and international relations, and as a person who worries about geopolitics and international relations, war and conflict, I want to know the 5-year view, and I want to know the 10-year view. And I think that, again, we hope this study helps elucidate that. The second thing we look at, which a lot of people have looked at, but again, we look at it as sort of a competitive framework, is energy prices. And again, not just energy prices in 2050, but energy prices over the whole chain of implementing these policies for 40 years. And finally, and which came out with the most shocking results, we ran the program backwards and then looked at what is the actual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, in 2020, 2025, 2030, 2050. And many of these policies that are being advocated as policies to greatly lower U.S. greenhouse gas emissions either don't lower U.S. greenhouse gas emissions at all, or lower them by such a small amount that on a global basis it's a joke, right? And so we really want to focus the debate on what we call what would really work, right? So some people are going to look at this study and say, hey, this study is pro-electric cars, or this study is anti-tax, or this study is pro-markets, or this study is this or that. But that is really not the purpose of this study. The purpose of this study is to show distinctly what the trade-offs are and what would actually lower greenhouse gas emissions, and if so, by how much. So the history of U.S. energy policy is rife with unintended consequences. We need to have a proper cost-benefit analysis of outcomes. We need to look at those outcomes and not have them take second place to political expediencies or to particular political constituencies. We endeavor in this study to give a fuller picture of these long-term consequences and put in question, you know, like Anderson Cooper, keeping them honest. If someone's going to stand up and say this is going to do something in 20 years or 50 years, we want to tell you whether it will or won't. Some of the results are going to be incredibly different than common wisdom. Some of the results are going to come out and show things that are the opposite of things that I've said in the media over the past 5 years. So let me just say, the policy of this program is to be fact-based and statistical. There are people in this room and graduate students and Rice undergraduate students who have spent the last 3 years spending hours and hours and hours typing data into computer stacks, right? And that is what this research is based on. This is not about my opinion, right? It's not about the faculty's opinion or our students' opinion, right? This is data-driven. Our goal here is also not to pick a winner. Our goal here is just to show the trade-offs of one approach over another. So with that, I'm going to just briefly go over some of what I thought were the more shocking results. I think if I had to sum up the overall conclusion of the study, what I would tell you is that politically appealing policies don't always bring about the intended consequences that they're being stated to bring, right? So let me show you. Oop, that didn't work. Let me show you a few just basic facts. Clearly, from doing our analysis, there seems to be this sort of very hidden, embedded trade-off between lowering oil use and imports and lowering greenhouse gas emissions. It's often said that if we would just lower oil use, we will lower greenhouse gas emissions and vice versa. The study did not actually show that. The second thing is that most of the policies that we analyzed, and Ken will talk about that later today, what the different scenarios were, but they were the ones you would expect, different forms of cap and trades with offsets, cap and trade without offsets, a carbon tax of $30, a carbon tax of $60, a national renewable portfolio standard, a mandate for a certain percentage of electric cars. Surprisingly, almost all of the scenarios really actually don't lower the percentage of U.S. imports of oil. That was a shocking result. Many of the most effective policies are going to be the ones that are going to cost the most to American consumers and the economy. We found that a 50% cap, which is absolutely the most effective policy to lower our greenhouse gas emissions in a substantial way in line with discussions in the global community, we found that that could triple electricity prices over time. The other thing, again, you know, Elle magazine gave me a prize for advocating solar energy, so let me put my cards on the table. Renewable energy is not going to be the be-all, end-all for lowering oil demand, and honestly, it didn't even turn out to be necessarily the be-all, end-all for lowering greenhouse gas emissions. We absolutely felt that studying the scenarios related to electrification of vehicles, that can absolutely have a positive impact on energy security over time. We also found, given all the greenhouse gas quantification of what different policies might mean, clearly acting alone, the United States is going to have difficulty making a dent in greenhouse gas emissions by itself, even if we took the most stringent policies. Many of the policies that tax or price carbon will absolutely alter the business as usual picture for natural gas. The business as usual picture for natural gas virtually eliminates the need for liquefied natural gas, LNG imports for years to come. When we put in some of these other policies, that is not going to be the case. The biggest winners of a $30 U.S. carbon price would be Venezuela and Iran. Subsidizing renewable energy, we didn't find would necessarily grow GDP. We did not find that a national renewable portfolio standard would lower U.S. oil use or foreign imports, and it would only trim 4% off of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We also questioned this first mover advantage. With all due respect to Tom Friedman and his op-ed of today, there is no evidence that being the first one to do solar energy and then having protectionist measures to try to hold those jobs in the United States would actually be the optimum strategy for lowering overall global emissions. And Bob Harris from HARC will talk to us this afternoon about actually what the UN has been trying to do on the subject of embedded carbon and how counterproductive it might be to be taking a first mover approach. Because if we really actually care about global emissions, we shouldn't be thinking about first moving. And then finally, as Dr. Stavens has already mentioned, and I think probably has comprehensive work that we could all benefit from on his website, cap and trade design is going to be critical in determining the cost to consumers and the impact on domestic industry. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures. Let me describe these pictures for you. The black line as it runs through the other cases, and this is not all the cases we run, we just want to be illustrative. The black line is the demand line. As you can see, the electric vehicle case and the cap of 50% on emissions is definitely the two most effective ways to lower oil demand in the United States. Let me add the extra statistic that if you take the EV case out to 2050, it would lower oil demand by an additional 2.5 million barrels a day beyond the savings of 3 million barrels a day we're going to see from the current CAFE standard. So if we were to just care about lowering our percentage of U.S. imports, going to a penetration rate, a mandated penetration rate for electric vehicles could cut U.S. imports to 40% from the current 60% by 2050. If that's our goal, of all the things we tested, that would be the highest achievement. But that program, done alone, would only curb U.S. carbon emissions by 8%. By 2050, which is a pretty small number, given the challenges facing us. A renewable portfolio standard implemented nationally would only lower our emissions by 4%. And as you can see from looking at the visual, it's going to do virtually nothing to lower our oil use in the United States. Just to show you emissions consequences for how many tons of CO2, billion metric tons of CO2 could be eliminated by various policies. The black line, of course, is the reference case. And you can see, unfortunately, many of the very popular policies don't provide a tremendous difference. That's the bottom chart from the reference case. And really only, having a really strict and enforceable policy for 50% cap is going to really take us to something truly significant. Natural gas. Let's looking at the reference case. I think the interesting thing about the reference case, what I call the no policy case, is, like I said, under the no policy case, we're not going to need imports of natural gas for 2 decades or more. If we put on a carbon tax of $30 and we apply it across the board, what we wind up in 2040 is needing a tremendous amount of LNG. We empower, again, countries that the United States is trying to curb their petropower. We wind up back with the kind of Ukraine, Russia, Iran scenario in the gas market, that possibility of a gas OPEC, that would be totally avoidable if we had no policy at all. So I'm not saying we should have no policy, but we need to understand what the consequence of the policy would be. If you look at the EV case for electrification of vehicles, it does indeed increase demand for electricity, and therefore, of course, that has an impact on natural gas and on our need for imports over time. I did not put it in here in the slide, but I invite you to come and look at the paper. With all due respect to Mr. Pickens, the result of putting the CNG into our vehicles directly instead of electrification is unbelievably dramatic for how much higher natural gas would be, and our imports for LNG would go up to 50% of our gas use, and the increase in gas demand would be very, very large. So his contention that we have so much shale gas that we could just completely shift our car fleet, we need to remember that shifting our car fleet would take 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, and by the time we'd get there, we would be importing all of the natural gas from foreign sources, some of which would be very unstable. Wholesale electricity prices under the different cases. As I mentioned, it sounds very attractive. We all feel the appeal of renewable energy. Everybody wishes it would be easy to transition to renewable energy, but the reality is that that would be the most expensive way to try to lower emissions. And the only emissions, remember my statistics from before, so when you look at that giant green bar of cost in this last all the way to the right of my slide, remember that that's going to triple electricity prices. At the same time, it's only going to reduce 4% in U.S. national greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, for those who are concerned about competitive of U.S. industry, we did some playouts for how much industry relocation, what percentage of sort of heavy industry in the United States would relocate under different policies. And again, you can see that, honestly, electrification of vehicles really is so indistinguishable from having no policy in terms of relocating industry that it's hard for you to see the black line of the reference case. But obviously, in the 50% cap case, there would be a substantial relocation of industry. And as Bob will talk about later today, one has to question how much of that industry will result in actually a total global lowering of emissions, and how much will that result in moving the emissions to some other country. So that gives you a sense of some of the highlights of the study. I do want to just sum up with a few points, one of which I borrow from Daniel Sperling, for whom I'm a great admirer. He is always telling me, we are moving to an electric drivetrain. We don't have to do anything special. Perhaps if we did something special, we could do it better, faster, cheaper. But the bottom line is that technology is here, and it's going to come. And I like to tell a story of, we had the vice president for technology of Ford Motor Company was speaking one time at the Baker Institute, and he told this story, which I find delightful. He was talking about this electric drivetrain and the electrification of the vehicle in general. And he said that when he was a young man working in R&D, the head of marketing for Ford came downstairs and said, we've talked to the board and we'd like you to start working on a computerization of the car. We'd like the car to run more by computer, right? And his team worked and worked and worked, and after a few years, they brought the same vice president down to see the new car they had that ran mainly by computer, how systems running by computer, and they showed him that they were able to do it and only eliminate 30% of the truck space of the car for the computer. And the head of the vice president for marketing for Ford turned to this group of R&D scientists and they said, we will computerize our cars over my dead body. And this gentleman who was speaking at the Baker Institute made a sort of off-color comment. He said that that gentleman was now dead and that all of Ford's cars are run by computer and that they lost no trunk space. So that's what I would say about the electric drivetrain. It's coming, it's here. I do drive a hybrid car. I like the hum. I had to loan my car to my son because he got a speeding ticket in his car. And so to make him uncool, we put him in a Camry because, you know, then he's not like the other kids into some kind of a Mustang-y, you know, I'm 17, look at me type car. And I realized on his gasoline bill this month that there was only one charge. In an entire month, he only had to fill the car once. So the second thing is we have, as Mr. Malva mentioned, this really unique opportunity of onshore natural gas resource development. We need to think about how to utilize that to lower emissions. If we stay in the political arena as we are today, and we use the political arena to save jobs in coal, we will have wasted the potential of this natural gas industry's opportunity to provide cleaner fuel. I think it goes without saying, and Dr. Stavens reiterated this, cap and trade design is going to be essential. If done improperly, it will impact the future development of U.S. unconventional oil and gas in this country, and we'll have some presentations about that later today. We, again, have a unique opportunity. The cost for developing unconventional oil and gas is coming down greatly. Depending on how we handle cap and trade, we could virtually eliminate the use of that resource altogether and make ourselves even more dependent on imports. We need to consider that in thinking about what's our goal to 2050 and what are we going to do in the interim. So like I said, no one's saying that the policy shouldn't shoot for 2050, but to put in a policy in 2012 that would eliminate our own domestic natural resources in the period of 2020 and 2025 and make us highly dependent on the international market, I'm not sure that that's the best goal. So with that, I summarize to unquote Tony Blair. Climate and energy security policy aren't always actually two sides of the same coin. And in creating an optimum strategy, we really do need to take both into account. We need to look at climate policies that don't worsen our import balance and strengthen countries who are hostile to U.S. national interests. We have a whole other study on the flows, what it means to have a flow, the flow of petrodollars out of the United States into the international community and then back into the bubble economy of the investment world, and we'll have a presentation on that this afternoon. So there are a lot of unintended consequences that need to be evaluated before we embark on a major policy to lower our greenhouse gases. Well, I thank you very much. I don't know, we want to take a few questions, or maybe you guys are really hungry and we could talk about questions over each author. We have lunch is going to be across the way in our student center in our grand hall. We are now at 12:25. We will retake the session at 1:30. And we thank you for your attention this morning. We look forward to a fruitful discussion this afternoon.